Okay, you're all very, very, very welcome to DIT. Lovely to see so many of you here, familiar faces and unfamiliar faces here this evening for this lecture tonight by Dr. Jamil Khader, the ongoing Nakba and the disintegration of Palestinian education. In normal circumstances, if we had a scholar of this distinction coming to give us a lecture, he would be giving us a lecture on one of his many areas of scholarly expertise. He's authored two books, one on Slavoj Žižek, the other on post-colonial feminisms. He's got two more books in the pipeline. He served as a distinguished member of the academic community in the United States for many years, and then to the surprise of many of his colleagues, both in the United States and in Palestine, last September he returned to Palestine and took up the post in which he currently serves at Bethlehem University, where he's Dean of Research, where he's Professor of English, and he also edits the research journal there, the Bethlehem University Journal. And he is constructing a new and very interesting sounding framework for research in and about and connected to Palestine. But unfortunately, it's not normal circumstances, so that's not what he's here to talk about. He's here to talk about the situation that prevails for education in Palestine, the situation that's dramatized, of course, in the posters that you saw for this event that showed damage done to the Islamic University in Gaza in the onslaught last summer, but which, as the professor's title calls to our attention, is just part of an ongoing Nakba, an ongoing catastrophe, the continuing dispossession of the Palestinian people. So, without further ado, I'd like you to welcome Professor Jamil Khader, and we'll get about 45 minutes from him and about a half an hour for Q&A afterwards, okay?
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you, Harry, and thank you all for coming this evening. I really appreciate you coming here tonight. Thank you all, and I would like to extend the gratitude to the Palestinian ambassador, Mr. Abdel Razak here. I urged him yesterday to come, and he showed up, so thanks. Speaking of Zizek, I told the joke to Harry just a minute ago, so I'm going to tell it to you. Zizek collaborates with Alain Badiou, the famous French philosopher. So in one of his books, he dedicates his book to Alain. And he says, you can never have a better friend than Alain. Because in one of his lectures, Zizek is talking, Alain gets a phone call. Alain takes the phone, picks up the phone, and starts answering the call. And he looks at Zizek and he said, can you please shut up for a minute? So I hope that we're not going to do this today. Alrighty. It gives me really great pleasure to be here with you at Dublin Institute of Technology. Dublin really has a special place in my heart, and it's really easy to understand for a Joycean fan, whose alter ego for some time, in my younger years, was Stephen Dedalus for a long, long time. Stephen's rejection of the master's, as he calls it, acquired speech that my voice holds at bay and in whose shadow my soul frets, and his refusal to serve that which he, quote, no longer believed, whether it call itself my home, my fatherland, my church, resonated with my experience as a Palestinian third, fourth, or fifth class citizen of Israel, the state of the Jewish people, quote unquote. Dublin has really been my dream trip destination for many, many years. So when I was offered to accompany our wonderful students from Bethlehem University here in the front, Osama, Ilyas, Mira, and Lara, I jumped on that occasion. I didn't think twice. I just wanted to, and I can't wait to walk in the steps of Bloom in the next couple of days to remember that eventful day of June 16th, 1904. Before I go on, I would like first to extend my gratitude to two people, Professor John Kelly, and I would like to ask our students to come and help me. Thank you, John, for everything that you have done to Bethlehem University and to our student. John? Yeah. John, as you guys know, is the chair of or president of the Friends of Bethlehem University in Ireland. And to thank him, Lara's going to give him a little gift from us. You can show it to the people here. Thank you, John. I appreciate everything you have done. I would like also to, oh, of course, Tom, thank you. Thank you. I appreciate everything you have done for us. I would like also to thank Jim Roach and Academics for Palestine. And Jim, we have also something for you here that Mira and Osama are going to give you on behalf of the students and the university, which is a map of Palestine here. And I would like also to thank the University College Dublin Student Union President, Fergal Hines, who we gave him something yesterday, so we're not going to repeat that again. But Fergal has been really great, very hospitable and generous, and spent so much time with us here on this trip, and we really appreciate your efforts here and hope to continue this collaboration between us. Thank you. So let's start. Technology issues. Okay, so the title of my talk tonight is The Ongoing Nakba and the Disintegration of Palestinian Education. The Nakba, for those who are not familiar with the term, is the lexical referent to catastrophe in Arabic and refers to the founding, what I call the founding historical event in modern Palestinian national consciousness, namely the destruction of Palestine and the Zionist ethnic cleansing project that commenced in 1948 and continues until today. Excuse me for a second. Sorry. Allergies. Yes, absolutely. I got my arsenal with me here. Sorry about that. So, throughout my presentation, you're gonna see this map a lot, and I use this as the shrinking map of Palestine, or the map of shrinking Palestine. I'm going to use it intentionally throughout this presentation as a recurrent tool or motif to invoke the specter of the ongoing Nakba. You can see Palestine in 1947 on the far left during the partition until 1967, and now with the rise of the Kantons and the Bantustans in Palestine. So why talk about education today? The Palestinian education system is in shambles as a result of the Israeli military administration / colonial occupation policies that have systematically targeted and attacked the material and immaterial aspects of the system, including its infrastructure, administration, human capacities, curriculum and textbooks, the watering down of the curriculum, and high dropout rates, about 50% in the 1980s when the education system was under Israeli control. And when I came back to Palestine from the United States on a Fulbright Fellowship 2 years ago, I was really stunned to know that in a recent study, 33% of Palestinian students could not point to Jerusalem on the map. I was horrified. And I thought that there must be something done. And I think, I want to thank Harry for the introduction, of course. And I say I'm not really an expert in education, but as an educator or somebody who has been in education for over 25 years, I have a sort of a sense of what's going on, even though I had to do also my research, as we are trained to do, in order to be able to present to you the issue. But I also didn't want it to be just simply an enumeration, a catalog of these are the bad things that are happening. As a scholar and a researcher, I always look for a new argument, and hopefully you will see my argument later and we can talk about it as well. Experts working in the field of education in conflict zones define attacks on education as any intentional threat or use of force carried out for political, military, ideological, sectarian, ethnic, religious, or criminal reasons against students, teachers, education, and institutions. The Israeli attacks on the Palestinian education in the occupied Palestinian territories exemplify the full spectrum of attacks on education, including the denial of access to education in a situation of protracted occupation with recurrent hostilities, as well as periods of high-intensity conflict. This is from a document by Save the Children. Yes, sir?
You're losing your microphone there.
Oh, okay, sir. Is that better?
No, I think the battery might be dying in it or something.
Still red.
Yeah, I think it's okay.
Is it?
Yeah, that's a new battery today. Oh, is it? Yeah.
Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Okay. Can you hear me again? According to the Palestinian Center for Human Rights, Israel's actions with regard to the right to education are inconsistent with its binding obligations under international law. The magnitude of this systematic attack on Palestinian education is enormous, to the extent that the achievement of the Millennium Development Goals on education in Palestine is, quote, and this is a quote again from the Palestine Center for Human Rights, page 5, is currently proving unattainable as a result of the illegal policies enacted as part of Israel's long-standing occupation. So, okay, so what is the problem? Go fix your education. Well, there's a huge problem, of course. There's obviously the Hasbara issue, the Israeli propaganda in the world, that has put the heat on Palestinian education as part of its strategy to score political points in international public opinion. So what the Israeli Hasbaradists, or Hasbara Imagineers, as I like to call them in my writings, allege that Palestinian education and universities and public schools are hotbeds for inciting hostility against Israel and as spaces for indoctrination, creating a culture of hate. And there's an anecdote that I want to share with you. When I was at Stetson University in Florida, I served as director of gender studies and also as a co-chair of diversity. And I worked with many students, including Jewish student organization on campus. And I actually was behind a lot of the activities that they were engaged in. Because on that campus in particular, a lot of anti-Semitism was going on, to the extent that American Christian students would throw money at the Jewish students and say, well, pick it up, you're a Jew. Aren't you supposed to be picking it up? I mean, I grew up in Arab society, supposedly anti-Semitic. I've never heard of such atrocious story. But my students broke down in my classes telling these stories about the way that they were treated. So they invited me to meet the Israeli consul from Miami. And when I asked him, we were talking, and I said, well, when is this going to end? So he said, when the Palestinians change their education. I said, are you kidding me? So this is retroactively the reason why you occupied Palestine? Because you thought that in the future they're going to write education books or textbooks that are going to be teaching people how to hate you or whatever, out of nowhere. The other part of the problem is, of course, Western media bias. How many of you hear in the news about the destruction of institutions, of educational institutions in Palestine? How many of us hear about the way that students are treated on a daily basis in Palestine, or foreign scholars who visit Palestine? It's something that is completely out of the news. It's completely unreported, with also little effort to hold Israel accountable for its violations of Palestinians' right to education. So what is my point tonight? What I would like to emphasize is that understanding the decline and disintegration of Palestinian education cannot be disconnected from the history of the ongoing Nakba that the Palestinians have suffered since 1948 under the Israeli apartheid policies and Zionist settler colonial project. This fallout has been aggravated in the context of the global capitalist economy, with the integration of Palestine as a peripheral economic zone through the Israelification of the neoliberal global capitalist economy in the region. And this is where Zizek really helped me articulate some of these issues. I have written about everything when it comes to identity politics as part of the things that I've done in my life. I wrote about feminism, I wrote about gay rights, I wrote about Islamophobia, I wrote about colonialism, everything. But I've always felt that there's something missing. what can really hold us all together. And I had the honor with the students today to meet President Michael D. And actually, when he gifted me his book, one of his books that I tried to read before coming to Ireland, but it didn't work. I couldn't find it. He gave it to me today and he autographed it to me. And he talked about his socialist legacy, and I was reading a little bit from the book. And actually, I think that we need to reclaim that legacy, probably redefine it a little bit, but we need to find a common denominator between many constituencies around the world. And to me, and again, going back to Zizek, it's the fundamental antagonism, the class struggle. I'm not sort of a hardcore Marxist, but a sort of a post-Marxist in a Zizekian way. But we will see what I mean. I know Ronit says, Zizek talks a lot, but I still think that he has something useful to say. The reason that I'm saying this is that when you look at what's going on in Palestine, the Israeli occupation policy does not only stop at producing what following Foucault and other people, what we call producing docile citizens, denationalized, docile colonial subjects, alienated from their national identity, culture, and heritage, and history. But also, and what's really important is that they're trying to create unskilled labor force that can meet the demands and needs of the Israeli labor market. Within, again, the changes that are happening in the world economy. So, disappearing Palestine again. You know that we're moving now, transitioning to part one. And in part one, and before I go into a little bit of detail into the strategies and techniques that the Israelis have been using in order to impoverish the Palestinian system and destroy it, I would like to talk a little bit about, or give you a historical context to understand the ongoing Nakba. And I'm going to do it symptomatically by looking at my own personal story. So you'll understand a little bit of my investment in it. And I call it infinite traces, and you will know where is that coming from. This is Tantura. Tantura is a little Palestinian village, of course, in 1948. This is the city before 1948, where both my family and both sides of my family come from this little village. It's about 15 miles south of Haifa, about 24 kilometers south of Haifa. It was, the city was built on the ruins of a Canaanite village called Dor, which means home. This city was destroyed in 1948. Now, my family was displaced from there. A big chunk of my family was actually displaced into different parts of the world, in Jordan, Syria, Lebanon, some into Gaza, and then North Africa, etc., etc. We were lucky. My immediate family was the sort of lucky one, or ones. They moved or were displaced into a little village called Fredis, Paradise in Persian, just across 3-4 kilometers from the beach, from the Mediterranean on the Carmel Mountain. And the story there lives with me and with the people of the village, and really is a big part of the way that the consciousness of the people of Fredis has been formed. Now, why is this important? And what is the infinite traces that I talked about? In his seminal book, Orientalism, the late Palestinian intellectual Edward Said addresses the personal dimension of his academic study, the book on Orientalism. He says that we are all invested in the subjects we study. But for Said, this means accounting for the need to compile an inventory of the quote-unquote infinity of traces that left their mark on him due to their personal process. And the story of Tantura is really one of those infinite traces that impacted me and the way that I think about the world. So what happened there is that in 1948, and a week after the declaration of Israel as a state of the Jewish people, the Jewish terrorist group Haganah and its armed wing of the Alexandroni Brigade committed one of the largest massacres in Palestine, murdering about 300 men, 200 women and children. This was part of the Zionist, what they call Plan Dalet, of conquest and expulsion, and what Ben-Gurion's referred to as bi'ur, ethnic cleansing, a term that was actually used in 1948. So Ilan Pappé did not really invent the term, he just recovered and reclaimed a term that was used at the time. And the people of the village, including my maternal grandfather, if you read the Wikipedia entry into it, you will see his testimony there. And Danny Katz, the Israeli post-Zionist historian who actually uncovered the massacre, interviewed my grandpa. I wasn't home at the time, I was already in the United States. But he talked about digging collective graves. And this is an actual picture of it. It was contested by the Israeli army, but it was proven to be an authentic photo. And this is a picture of some of the captives and the war that was taken by the Red Cross. So half the civilians were shot in a rampage. The rest were marched to the beach, where the men were separated from the women and children. They were taken to a wall near the mosque, where they were shot in the back of the head. The locals were ordered to dig their own graves before they were shot and buried in them. And as I said, and this is a commemoration of the Tantura massacre just about the 21st, it was a Friday, last Friday of May. People from my village decided to commemorate the Tantura massacre, and they held this event, a memorial for them at Tantura. And I chose this picture from what I've seen on Facebook because it's the family of my mother, Diknash. Two of her uncles were murdered there, and about 3 or 4 of my father's uncles, maternal uncles, also were murdered in that massacre. But remember that effectively the citizens or the people who were killed at the time were practically Israeli citizens. It was a week after the establishment of the State of Israel. And so their massacre conspicuously exposes what I call the obscene ethnocentric ideology that sustains and supports the alleged democratic ideals of the modern Jewish state. There's no way you can reconcile a Jewish state with a democratic state. There's no way, simple. Again, this was a subject of a heated debate in Israel, and in many ways gave birth to what is called now post-Zionist historiography, historical analysis that contests the foundational myths of Zionism as a racist and colonial ideology. So, well, I'm using the Tantura as an example to show Israel's strategy over Palestine, all over Palestine, which incorporated variants of ethnic cleansing, apartheid, and genocide, grounded in a long legacy of Western colonial history, especially British imperialism, that has mutated into the current colonial occupation system and its apartheid policies. And we'll talk about that in a bit. So, what about education then? When I was looking for a sort of nice photos to use, I was struck by this image that some people thought it was real on Facebook. There's something called photoshopping today. And what struck me about the semiotics of this story is really, of this picture, is the girl, the wall, the non-ending wall, the ladder that she's holding in her satchel, walking to the school. But I thought it was really an effective representation of the daily struggles that resilient, creative, and steadfast Palestinian students endure in pursuit of their education, which has really become impossible to attain. And in talking about the history of Palestinian education, we have to think about the 5 different distinct periods through which the history of Palestinian education can be traced. From left to right, you can talk about the Ottoman Empire. And during the Ottoman period, the emphasis was on basic reading skills, Quranic studies, Islamic studies, but there was a high illiteracy rate. During the British Mandate, the British colonial system weakened the Palestinian, the Arab educational system. They charged high fees, high school fees, limited tertiary education, but favored Jewish education at the period. When Palestine, or the West Bank and Gaza, were under Arab stewardship between 1948 and 1967, They developed the educational system, not much, but they tried to sort of work on it. Offer tertiary education in their universities, so people studied in the Arab world. And then open market to Gulf countries. That's why there was a sort of a brain drain back then from many Palestinian intellectuals into the Gulf area and other countries. Then from 1967 to 1993, the period of the Israeli occupation, where you can witness a systematic attack on the material and immaterial aspects of the education. Then under the PA, from 1993 till today, where the education system is really constrained within the restrictions embedded in the Oslo Accords. And I'll talk about that maybe in the QA session because I will not really have time to cover all of them. The most important thing for me in this presentation is to focus on column 4, the Israeli occupation, which was characterized by different policies, including absentee property law, expropriation and destruction of land, house demolitions, incarcerations, and discriminatory and racist laws. And actually, I'm going to skip this part. We can talk about it if you want more information. But the result of that policy was the destruction of infrastructure in Palestine in general, mass-scale loss of possessions, mass migration and displacement, psychological devastation, trauma, PTSD. And I was happy to know that, or to read in the President's book, President Higgins' book, and he has a short chapter on Gaza and Palestine, and he really addresses the issue of the trauma that the children of Palestine endured under the occupation. We talk about lack of security, the emergence of captive economy, unfair competition, the environmental dumping that is still going on, racism and discrimination, and underdevelopment. And I'll talk about a couple of things that are peculiar to the West Bank and also to Gaza, because there's also a difference in the way that they were implemented. So again, the map. So one thing that we need to start with is understanding that the Israelis really legalized the attack on education. They issued various military orders, including the infamous one, Military Order 854, in 1980 to modify the Jordanian Education Law number 16 of 1964 pertaining to educational institutions requiring less than 4 years. So what they did is that they simply struck off the last phrase about less than 4 years, extending the law's mandate to universities as well. That's why there's a feel that some of these universities are really grade 13, like another stage of high school, still until today. And this is something that struck me as a Palestinian expatriate coming back, and I'm just like, what's going on here? We have to get out, to snap out of this kind of attitude. But when I was doing this research back then, I really realized that the problem is really, really deep. This meant, among other things, that the universities were subordinated to the same regulations that apply to the primary and secondary schools. It gave the Israeli military governor complete authority over matters of education in the occupied territories, violated international conventions on children's right to education. The most critical areas of this military order were school permits. And you will see when I start talking about the infrastructure what that really means. Student admission, faculty recruitment, curricula, and textbook control and supervision. It also required foreign staff to sign a loyalty oath as a requisite for obtaining work permits from the Israeli authorities, and also some Palestinian, actually, faculty and staff, and demanded that they refrain from any contact with a terrorist organization like the PLO. Back then, of course. This military order was frozen in 1982 after an international uproar, but not before many faculty and staff were deported for refusing to sign this oath. In Gaza, the Israelis issued about 6 of these military orders to control the education system and disrupted the daily operations of the system itself. Most important, I mentioned 3 of them. Military Order 374, which was issued in 1970, instituted closure policy of schools and higher education institutions that was really the basis for wide-ranging practices in the upcoming years during the Intifada and any sort of uprisings in the West Bank as well. Military Order 538, which was issued in 1976, increased tuition fees supposed to be free and universal human rights, but fined also destitute families in Gaza for late payments, about 10% of their tuition fees. And then finally, Military Order 574, which was issued in 1980, required renewal of operation permit every few months. So if you are operating a school, you had to sort of go and ask for a permit every 3 months. And imagine how easy it was to get them. It was a terrible ordeal, and the purpose of it, of course, was to sort of undermine the education system in any way possible. Why is this important to understand? And this is, again, a little, the last part of my context, is to sort of understand the rise of Israeli colonial occupation and the birth of apartheid in Palestine. This map, distorted a little bit distorted here, but it shows the segregated road system that is in use in Palestine. And this is really one thing that strikes you about the whole situation. I know some people are offended by the analogy to apartheid. I have my sort of questions about the analogy, but I'm using it also for my own purposes, which go back to my friend Zizek. But we can talk about that later. One image that really strikes people when they get into Palestine, and you probably have seen it in a zillion reports and news and photos by friends who are traveling in the area, is the racist apartheid wall. Okay? This sort of long, tall, thick cement wall that has created two separate societies, a state and an authority, only a mirror image of the two unequal and separate justice systems that pervade the Israeli apartheid policies. This apartheid wall is about 786 kilometers in length. It's between 2.5 to 9 meters high. It affects about 343,000 inhabitants who will be between the wall and the Green Line. It affects trees, especially olive trees, that are an important resource for Palestinians. And the wall uses about 43.5% from West Bank lands. And again, it completely surrounds about 100,000 people in 42 towns. It reduces the available water supply by 1 billion gallons. And this is something that I experienced the first time in Palestine when I moved to Bethlehem from Ramallah after I finished my Fulbright fellowship. And I decided to take the job in Bethlehem. And I rented an apartment in a town called Beit Jala, close to Bethlehem. And one day, Marie, my wife, said, Jamil, there's no water. I said, what do you mean there's no water? Of course there is water. Let's go and check. So actually, it turned out that they cut off the water on Beit Jala for 2 weeks. They give you water, running water for 3 days, and then they cut it off for 2 weeks or more. And one of my neighbors said that the max that they went through was about 21 days, about 3 weeks. And this is something that I was really stunned. And, you know, my daughters and my wife are from the United States. They grew up, you know, in that sort of environment. Everything is available. And suddenly they have to deal with severe water shortages. And I'll talk about that later when I address the issue of the settlements. So to build the wall, of course, they confiscated hundreds of thousands of acres of land. They severely restrict travel to jobs, hospitals, and schools, and that's why I'm mentioning it, because I'm trying to tie it to education in the end. And of course, adversely affect 4 out of 10 Palestinians. This is a picture that I took. I don't know if you can see the arches in there, but this was taken on my way from Bethlehem to the airport in Lod, Tel Aviv, Ben Gurion Airport, to take the flight to Dublin. These arches actually represent kind of a pristine image of nature. You can only see blue skies. And I love this image because it for me, encapsulates exactly the logic of apartheid in Israel. The wall is painted with those images of pure natural scene, of nothing other than the sky. The image on this wall, to me, stands for ethnic cleansing at its purest. A metaphor. I'm a literary man, so I'm always looking for metaphors and images, but it's sort of to bring to life the kind of issues that we are dealing with. And so they painted this. Maybe they thought, oh, look, you know, it's not drabby anymore. People can enjoy the image. But if you dig deeper into it, it's really a symbol of the kind of ethnic cleansing that is undergoing, that underpins the apartheid policies of the Israeli state and its settler colonial project. And as you remember with Golda Meir's slogan, a land without a people for a people without a land. And so this is basically the kind of Zionist utopia you get at its best. So for Palestinians, such ideological purification produces signs of unhomeliness and conditions of homelessness at home, carried out by everyday occupation practices of the apartheid Jewish state. And one of the major functions of this apartheid system, of course, is to protect and safeguard the growing number of illegal colonial settlements in Palestine. This is, by the way, the wall around Bethlehem. So if you come to visit us in Bethlehem, at Bethlehem University, this is what you have to see, and this is what you have to go through. This is when you enter Bethlehem from what is called checkpoint number 300. It doesn't have to do anything with the movie, the action film 300. But these settlements, as you can see, the devastating ecological impact that is occurring in Palestine on the tops of these hills and mountains, when they are uprooting all the trees and nature in order to build these ugly settlements. At the end of 2010, there were about 534,000 settlers living in 121 quote-unquote authorized settlements and about 102 unauthorized settlement outposts on the West Bank. There were about 19 settlements in the Gaza Strip which were evacuated in 2005 in Israel's unilateral disengagement plan. Now over 74 outposts, habitations built that are non-contiguous with the established settlements, were established after the Oslo Accord. These settlements are joined to each other and to Israel through bypass roads, which are for the exclusive use of Israelis, and which are also built on privately owned Palestinian land confiscated by the Israeli government. Now I have to say, in my reading of what's going on, maybe soon you will see something happening. I'm not really sure what it is. But the Israelis, Netanyahu government issued permits for doctors, Palestinian doctors. They can actually drive in their own cars with their Palestinian license plates, the white ones, into Israel if they have a medical, authorization or permit or certificate. And actually, when I was going to Ramallah last time, I saw a car. It didn't look like one with any medic sign or anything, but a car with an older man with also license plates, white license plates going in. And when I talked to Elan Papi when he was visiting Bethlehem University a couple of months ago, he said that what is actually happening now is that Israel is going to annex Area C, including Bethlehem. So these areas are going to be part of that sort of greater Israel. And now I was reading in the news that Shimon Peres said that they have no objection to negotiate with Hamas. So I think that you will hear about the new Palestinian state in Gaza, and something or another is going to happen to Palestine in the West Bank. It's scary. I don't know what's going to happen, but we'll see if that will go through. President Higgins says there's no way that a Palestinian state will be established in Gaza Strip. And he wrote the book a few years back. But again, we'll see what happens. So now, all of this led to the rise of the cantons in Palestine and the Bantustans. And according to the Second Oslo Agreement of 1995, the West Bank was divided into 3 areas, as you know. But actually, there are 5. Most people don't refer to H1 and H2. It becomes like a chemical table, a periodic table. But Area 1 is under full Palestinian Authority control, comprises about 18% of the occupied territories. Area B under Palestinian civil control, but joint Israeli-Palestinian security, 22% of the land. Area C under full Israeli control, comprises 60%, including most of Palestinian farmland and water under exclusive Israeli control. H1 area in Hebron is home to around 200,000 Palestinians and is under the control of the Palestinian authorities. The H2 area is inhabited by nearly about 50,000 Palestinians and 500 Zionist settlers and remain under Israeli control. So this is what and how is that affecting everything? Sari Makdisi, in his book Palestine Inside Out, talks about the way that the Israeli occupation of the West Bank is ultimately enforced by not only by the armed forces, but it's really an occupation by bureaucracy. Its primary forms of applications are application forms, title deeds, residency papers, and other permits. So you can imagine later on when we have a QA or in the reception, you can talk to our students and hear their stories about how they were able to get to Dublin from Bethlehem. It is this micromanagement of the daily life which does the job of securing the slow but steadfast Israeli expansion in the area. And actually, Ronit Lenton was really kind enough to give me her book, Thinking Palestine, and there are a couple of great articles in them, and one of them is by Hunaida Ghanem, who talks about the Thineda politics, the politics of death along checkpoints, and it's a book that I really recommend that you read, and the articles by different people there are really brilliant in their analysis of the situation in Palestine, especially if you are theory inclined a little bit. You want sort of to go beyond the news and just simply summarizing the events to sort of get that critical and theoretical depth. I really recommend Ronit's book. So how is this translated into these colonial occupation policies and apartheid policies on the ground? And here's part 3. First of all, of course, is the violation of education as a universal human right. The Israeli colonial occupation violates the universal human rights to education for Palestinian students for all ages and at all levels by denying them access to education due to security considerations. And when you read about this, scholars talk about four different essential features of education: availability, accessibility, acceptability, and adaptability. And all of them are undermined by these policies, which I talked about in general in the context. So this quote says, implementation of the right to education requires more than non-interference or allowing minimal standards. Inter alia, it requires that children be able to engage in education in a safe and healthy environment, conducive to learning with appropriate teaching tools. And obviously, the condition that we have described violates all of that. It is estimated that 8,000 Palestinian school children have been detained since 2000, again, limiting their access to education, and including also what happens to these kids in prison. Imagine these kids, 13, 14, 15, jailed for 2-3 years or more, having limited access to education, but also traumatized by the abuses that they undergo during imprisonment. And recent reports of torture of Palestinian children in prisons was just in the news a couple of weeks back. The Israelis in their control of the Palestinian education annulled compulsory education. Can you imagine? They annulled it, leading to a dropout crisis and exacerbated the social condition of Palestinian female students in particular. And of course, when I mentioned so far the West Bank and I talked about Gaza, but East Jerusalem is very important to talk about. A lot of the things that are happening in Israel and Israeli policy really has to do with East Jerusalem and the effort to Judaize East Jerusalem in particular. In West Jerusalem, you have about 56 preschool facilities. In East Jerusalem, for its Arab population, you have 2 municipal preschool facilities currently operating there that are not able to absorb about 15,000 students, 3 to 4-year-old children, entitled to free government-sponsored preschool education under Israeli law. As a result, 90% of them are left without any preschool education, while a small number rely on expensive private institutions. Add to that the lack of, in East Jerusalem, the lack of qualified teachers. Again, budgetary restrictions. Schools have great difficulties recruiting specialized teachers, and especially in the sciences and math. And because they have restrictions on access and mobility for people from the West Bank, they can't hire teachers from the West Bank. And obviously there is shortage in teaching materials and playgrounds. The second major infraction on the right to education in Palestine has to do with the issue of mobility and access to education. The mobility in particular, the Israeli restrictions on freedom of movement have for decades seriously hindered the ability of students to attend their schools and universities. And when you talk to our students, to these young women and men here, to hear about their 28 to 36 hour trip to come to Dublin, just imagine what people have to go through on a daily basis. Checkpoints, gates, and arrest of children, as well as clashes between students and Israeli military and military operations around schools, all constitute types of denial of access. There is systematic restriction, as I said, on the mobility of students and faculty, hindering their ability to attend schools, colleges, and universities, and other academic activities in Palestine and around the world. They limit students' access to education due, again, to the arbitrary thing called security considerations. They are a security threat. That's it. You cannot argue, and no court will oppose the decision. Banning Gaza students, for example, from attending Palestinian universities in the occupied territories. Bethlehem University had about 50 students from Gaza a few years back, but due to all of these restrictions, there is no single student in Gaza at Bethlehem or any of the other Palestinian universities in the West Bank. And as I will show later, they deny exit permits to winners of foreign scholarships and fellowships, such as Fulbright and Erasmus. An opportunity that is really given freely to many Israeli students. Our Palestinian students cannot really enjoy that privilege. Because, and there was a story about 7 students from Gaza who won a Fulbright fellowship from the United States. And the Americans, first of all, could not do anything for these students. But after an international uproar, that the Americans started putting pressure on the Israelis and allowed these 7 to leave. So they're called the 7 Fulbrighters. But the story happens every day in Palestine. And this is done through checkpoints, roadblocks, security fences, control towers, physical obstacles, forbidden roads, overtaking military vehicles, which you can do, of course, permits, movement between West Bank and Gaza, closures, siege, curfew, travel to the airport, which the Palestinians can do. When I came here, I drove from Bethlehem to Tel Aviv, and I took the plane to Istanbul. The whole trip was really easy and smooth. I had no issues. And when I met the guys in Istanbul, they were exhausted and tired because they hadn't slept for 20 hours or 24 hours at a time. This is really the system of checkpoints in the West Bank. I didn't count them really, but you can see there are really many. And when you drive around the West Bank, you can see these checkpoints and fly checkpoints. They decide, one day my wife and I and the girls were going back from Ramallah in the evening, and I said, well, let's take a different road this time. And then suddenly they decided to shut down the road. And there's a fly checkpoint in the middle of the road. And we were held there for 3 hours. Of course, I had to deal with my wife's anger for 3 weeks afterwards, but I didn't have anything to do with it. In 2011, 31% of 113 communities in the West Bank reported that school children, young people, and teachers had to cross 1 or more military checkpoints to reach their schools, affecting more than 2,500 children daily. And these are obviously fences around settlements. And barriers to education particularly affect Area C, that is under the Israeli control, and the H2 area in Hebron, with children facing long waits, buddy and school bag searches, and questioning when crossing checkpoints. So if you, for example, traveled to Israel or visited Palestine, and the way that they held you in the airport with all of these silly questions, right? You remember them? That's what they do to these children on a daily basis, every morning when these children go to the school. They combine, who bagged your sandwich? Did your mom bag it for you? What do you have? What kind of sandwich? Peanut butter and jelly or what? The combined effect of such practices results in physical injuries to children, loss of school days, to the difficulties in accessing controlled areas, longer commutes to avoid dangerous areas or crossing checkpoints, and psychological stress on children. So here's a scene of what you see when people are waiting at these checkpoints. And one of my favorite quotes of all time, of course, is POTUS Obama, President of the United States, Obama. Why I like Obama? Because, he complains. He says, and a great quote, What I also think he says is that there has been a very concerted effort on the part of some political forces to equate being pro-Israel and hence being supportive of the Jewish people with a rubber stamp on a particular set of policies coming out of the Israeli government, he said. So if you are questioning settlement policy, that indicates you are anti-Israeli, or that indicates you are anti-Jewish. If you express compassion or empathy towards Palestinian youth who are dealing with the checkpoints or restrictions on their ability to travel, and this is really why I chose this quote, then you are suspected in terms of your support of Israel. If you are willing to get into public disagreements with the Israeli government, then the notion is that you are being anti-Israel and by extension anti-Jewish. I completely reject that. And then in one of my Facebook posts I said, and then teary-eyed Obama proceeded to sign the new billion-dollar bill to support Israel military. Again, a picture of what the children had to go through every day. A quote from a member of the staff at Palestine Polytechnic University in Hebron. He says that our students on the way to school are sometimes stopped and subjected to questioning by Israeli intelligence personnel, then arrested for a few days before release. And again, we're talking about daily infringement on the right of students to education. Turning students and faculty back. For the past few weeks, I wanted to share with you the story of a village called Al-Za'im. About 6,000 people were locked behind these walls. This is a picture from Al-Za'im village. Behind a steel gate that forms part of Israel's massive wall in the occupied territories. Because the gate is only open for a few hours each afternoon, local children have to pass through a different exit than they normally would to attend school in nearby Jerusalem. A journey that should be no longer than 15 minutes can now take an hour. And this is again the story of some of our students who come from Jerusalem to Bethlehem. They go through the same process every day. I'll give you another example from H2 schools, you know, the area where you have the 400, 500 Jewish settlers, one of the nastiest creed of settlers there, by the way. And you probably heard about them a lot, the one who throw all of these nasty stuff on Palestinians in the market. The Palestinians try to cover themselves with a net, but refuse is spilled over. The school is called Qurtuba Primary School, which is located about 100 meters from the settlement of Beit Hadassah in H2, and is also close to the settlements of Tar Rumeida and Adamot Aishai. The school has about 160 students and 14 teachers, most of whom are forced to pass through at least one checkpoint every day in order to reach the school. Rarely are they able to walk to school without being harassed or assaulted by settlers and Israeli soldiers. Several students have suffered injuries, and some have even been hospitalized after being physically attacked by settlers. The settlers are emboldened by the prevailing culture of impunity generated by the lack of law enforcement against settlers by the Israeli occupying forces. And I argued in some of my articles, I sometimes do journalistic writing when I'm mad about something that is happening and I really want to express my opinion. I write on Al Jazeera. And in one of my arguments, I really said that whatever is happening with the settler violence is really just simply symptomatic of the state violence that is happening every day. So when people simply focus on the settlers, that's why I don't really talk about them much, because the problem is bigger, it's structural. It's a structural problem that comes from the state itself. And of course, in Cordoba, they use metal detectors. And a recent, again, infringement on the right of education. Teachers from Cordoba Primary School were given orders by the Israeli soldiers manning the checkpoint and maybe also womaning the checkpoint at the northern entrance of the Al-Shahada street that they must pass through a metal detector, which was not there before. The orders apply to everyone, even pregnant women and people suffering from health conditions that can be exacerbated by the metal detectors. The other attack that you see on Palestinian education has to do with the hidden curriculum and the alienation and colonial control. And those of you in colonial studies or post-colonial studies remember all of that debate that was happening in Africa and India, other places in the 50s and 60s. And we are still dealing with it in Palestine. Because the education system in Palestine was subjected to Military Order 854, if you remember, giving the military governor direct authority and control over the content of the education system. Obliteration of Palestinian national identity, history, and culture in accordance with the fundamental myths of the Zionist ideology. They have banned books and modified the content of the curriculum. And they have watered down academic content as well as vocational training and prevented modernizing and updating them according to recent developments and the specific disciplines. And obviously, they have rewritten everything from the perspective of Jewish history. In the early 1970s, one of the early battles, this is a quote from Baramki, who was the president of Birzeit University. He has a great book on the struggle of Palestinian universities under occupation, and I'd really recommend reading his book. He says that one of the early battles of Palestinian universities was over textbooks, as the military governor wanted to approve them. As time went by, the military government became increasingly obsessed with our reading lists. Books were ordered from abroad, were often permanently confiscated without us even setting our eyes on them. Among those banned were works on archaeology and history, as well as several journals on Arabic literature. And to contend with this obstacle, Palestinians developed, or university developed, what is called an informal network of couriers to carry books and journals into Palestine. So everything is contraband. The fourth thing that I want to talk about is what I call the politics of deracination. From 1967 to 1982, the Israeli military authorities in the occupied territories did not establish a single school. Not one new single school was built in those years. Existing schools lacked basic amenities and were under-equipped. 53% only 53% had libraries, 53% had no labs. And what I found really funny and ironic and really sad and tragic is that the budget allocated for labs in Bethlehem area in 1980 to 1981 was 4 Jordanian dinars. 4 Jordanian dinars. The equivalent, yes sir. Sure, I'll do that. I know it's a long thing, but I'll go quickly through this. The other thing, of course, is the structures were dilapidated, maintenance and renovation required, unobtainable permits, crowded classrooms, 50 students or more per classroom, renaming schools to obliterate Palestinian history. Again, the chronic shortage of classrooms. School demolitions, many schools were destroyed. Many schools were not allowed to operate. The destruction of infrastructure of universities and university properties. This picture that I thought was really great, Jim used it also in his poster, and I thought, oh great, we are great, what is it? Exactly, yeah. Great minds think alike. Again, what happens in Gaza on a daily basis, look at school there. I always, when I look at it, the first image that comes to me is the War of the Worlds, you know, the aliens. It looks like a little alien coming out of nowhere. Every time I look at it, I just have an image of wells. Also, of course, with these attacks, students were killed, teachers were killed, schools were destroyed, etc. Damage to 43 educational facilities prevented 25,000 children from returning to school. Approximately 462,000 Palestinian students missed school due to the closure, interruption, and damage to the education system. And people would ask, why don't they repair them? Well, simply because they can't get permits. You're not allowed. And actually, the Israelis prohibiting the transport of cement in Gaza, so they cannot build these schools or rebuild them. Raids on school. The army, you know, the Israeli army has raided these schools, entered them or attempted to enter school premises for search operations to remove Palestinian flags or to protect Israeli settlers. In 2002, Bethlehem University was under siege, and there was some destruction of property. Here's an image from outside of Bethlehem University, the ICP Institute. Repeated campus raid again in Birzeit University, Polytechnic, Al-Quds University, the Arab American University. All of these universities were subjected to these raids. And this is an image from 2014 when the Israeli army actually raided Birzeit University when I was there doing my Fulbright. Heavily armed soldiers attacked and arrested students, detained university guards, destroyed university property and equipment, confiscated student organization and materials, turned schools into prisons, closure and curfews that basically limited the ability of students to move and attend schools, in addition to interrogation and arrest of faculty and students. And this is actually an interrogation order. Someone was summoned and he posted it on Facebook, a badge of honor. So I downloaded it and I said, this is going to come into use later in one of my lectures maybe. A story of a student at Bethlehem University, Berlanti Azzam, in 2009, who actually was arrested by the Israelis on her way from Ramallah to Bethlehem, and she was deported to Gaza. She was one of the Gaza students at Bethlehem University, but this is Berlanti there. And there was an international uproar concerning Berlanti, but she was not allowed to go back. Incarceration, assassination of students, special exit permits for students, etc., etc. The long-term effects are many. I can talk about them later in the question. But I wanted to end with one thing that I really wrote and I wanted to share with you because it takes me back and do some sort of full closure and take me back to Joyce. So bear with me. I promise I'll be done. I'm fine, thank you, Osama. Osama is really helpful. So everybody during the trip, Osama is the first to help, to jump to help. And I always tell him, Osama, slow down, let people handle it. Okay, so what I wanted to say is this. I know it's here, it's here, it's here.
Can easily be lost between 350 pages.
Yes, absolutely. I agree with you. So I started by referring to Joyce. I found it, you see. I started by referring to Joyce and Bloom's journey around Dublin. Now, of course, despite my admiration for Joyce, I could not avoid criticizing Joyce, what I called in one graduate paper, regressive politics over Palestine in Ulysses, to the consternation of my professor at Penn State. He was an Irish-American professor. In his attempt at escaping what the critics call, I don't know, you Dubliners have to tell me if that's true, Dublin's paralyzing atmosphere, Bloom is libidinally invested in sexualized colonial fantasies about a model Zionist settlement farm, the Turkish-based Agudat Netaim at Kenner, Tiberias, where he imagines the land planted with his beloved olives and other exotic fruits. Although he rejects the idea of investing in the colonial settlement, which is a plus for Joyce, Bloom does not repudiate the Zionist settler colonial project altogether, for he still fantasizes about perfect citrons shipped to Ireland. He also bemoans the decline of the holy and fertile land of Palestine into a bleak and desolate country, which he compares to the withered sexual organs of an old woman. Bad Joyce. In one of his letters, Joyce wrote that Ulysses is the epic of two races, Israel and Ireland. But he was also reported to say to Richard Ellman that, quote, Ulysses did not want to go off to Troy. He knew that the official reason for the war, the dissemination of the culture of the Hellas, was only a pretext for the Greek merchants who were seeking new markets. Therein lies, I think, Joyce's missed opportunity to have made the link between Zionism and Western imperialism as the engine of the global capitalist world order. Nonetheless, when I was rereading the passage, a more unequivocal position that Joyce left for us to ponder is Molly's rejection and spitting out of the olives. Maybe it's a rejection of colonialism. Perhaps an index of the marginal corporeal inscription of a truly radical and egalitarian politics that are always written on the body, perhaps more emphatically on the female body. And I'm like Zizek and Lacan, I believe that woman is the true radical subject. Today, and despite the politics of blackmail and intimidation that can be born on the body and the soul, this marginal egalitarian space is growing thanks to the efforts of the Teachers Union of Ireland, Academics for Palestine, BNC, BDS National Committee, FBUI, the Friends of Bethlehem University in Ireland, student unions, Dublin City Council, the Ireland Palestine Solidarity Campaign, and many well-known figures such as Seamus Dean, Alva Smith, Luke Gibbons, Ronit Lenton, Joe Cleary, Karen Allen, Kathleen Lynch, and others. Now we can come back to Dublin and bask in its atmosphere of international solidarity and support for the struggle for liberty, liberation, and justice for all. Thank you.
to spark a few questions and comments and interjections and intersections. I don't know what will. There's an awful lot to engage with there. We've only got probably 20 minutes, 15, 20 minutes. We don't want to stay too long because there's food down the hall. We want and drink. But we'll soon be food and drink down the hall, so we want to take that. So what I'll do, if you don't mind, Jamil, is I'll let 3 or 4 people ask questions and do try to keep it to questions rather than dissertations. And then we'll come back to Jamil every 3 or 4 questions, and we'll try to finish it up in about 20 minutes. Okay, I'll give the microphone to people. I'm going to start with Ronnie here, and I know there's another gentleman there.
Thank you very much, Jamil, for a very.
Thank you.
Is that?
Yes, working.
Is that for a very interesting lecture? I feel rather upset in a way that for this your village was seen from my window in Haifa on the Carmel, and I'm one of your colonizer, and also we used to go every Saturday to Santura to bathe. But apart from that, I wanted to ask you one thing you didn't mention: the way that teachers, particularly in 48 Palestine, were forced by the Shin Bet to act as informers, and if they didn't, they were not allowed to teach. So maybe you want to come and comment on that.
Thanks very much for a very interesting presentation. I'm just curious in general about the life in the West Bank and just how does it operate. I'm thinking in terms of really like day-to-day commerce. You know, what do people live on? And can they go to work because we've got all the walls and all the holdings, etc. That. Just how does it operate and all? I'm curious about it. Thanks.
Other questions? Yeah.
Just wondering, does teaching happen outside of the school buildings and the university buildings? Are there other ways that that's
You talked about the unskilled labour for Israel, and your whole lecture charts the destruction and dilapidation, the systematic degeneration of the educational system. But how can you link anything very sort of, can you pinpoint, because it's so chaotic in one way what you've described, but yet there's a system behind it. How does that directly link to unskilled labour?
Mm-hmm. We'll take one more and then I'll come back to
Yeah, if somebody, I don't know who would be able to answer this, but I'm wondering about the student unions in Palestine and how they operate. I know that USI went to Israel recently to meet with the Israeli student union, and I know that they did try and get in touch with the Palestinian student union, but I'm not sure if that actually worked out in the end. So I'm wondering, is their access blocked in terms of Palestinian student unions and communicating with student unions outside Palestine that might be trying to engage in solidarity, etc.?
Okay, I'll come back to Jamil to try to do something with those few questions. Sorry, did you? No.
Thank you for these questions. Ronit's question first. I understand, we have to sort of deal somehow with our complicity in our history and sort of coming to terms to unsettling our values, of course. What I've been hearing about Ronit is that he's the staunchest supporter of Palestine and Ireland, and people really appreciate that, and I love you for that. And obviously, we have to struggle with all of these demons in our past. Not everybody is born a freedom fighter, not everybody is born educated about the world. It's a process of education, and it really requires a lot of courage to come out and say, I reject that, I refuse that, and I'm not going to continue living that. So kudos to you, Ronit. In terms of teaching in 1948, actually, before leaving to the United States, I was a high school teacher. And I taught actually in primary, middle, and high school. And I used to write back in Palestine before I left in a newspaper called Kul al-Arab. Samih al-Qasim used to be, the famous poet, used to be the editor. And I used to publish a bi-weekly or tri-weekly column on politics and culture. And but in my classes, I was never sort of political. I always sort of, you'll understand how political I am, but I will never politicize the classroom. And I don't do that in the United States or Bethlehem University either. But you can really teach students how to be political without sort of politicizing the teaching. Because I don't see myself as doing propaganda, really. I want people to be critical thinkers. One day, one of my students comes to me, and I was teaching English as a second language, shaking. His name was Sammy. And I said, what's going on? He said, you know, I was arrested. They interrogated me. They wrote something that was really bad about Jews and Nazis. And then one of the teachers snitched on them. So they arrested the student. And the student came to my house in the evening, and he was shaking, terrible. I said, Sammy, what's going on with you? He said, you don't know. I was interrogated. I was arrested. I said, so what's going on? He said, they kept asking about you. And I said, well, what did they want to know? And he said, they wanted to know everything that you teach us. Well, I told them, tell them about the present simple and the future perfect. Everything that I teach you. Tell them, don't be shy. But there is a lot of pressure. And I know that in the political, or many positions in the Israeli Arab, as they call it inside, the Palestinians inside Israel, the political system and many positions that were politicized, so many people who actually collaborated or had sort of a polar connection with higher ups, they ended up in good positions. And the good position was for them is a principal of a high school. That was really the most that people aspired to. You see, it's very simple. It's not, you know, education wasn't really with the magnitude that it is today now around the world, but that's what really people wanted to do. But there has always been these stories, and there has always been these pressures on teachers to simply stick to the curriculum. And now, obviously, with the recent, for example, banning of even the word Nakba to be used in classes. Okay, so how can you really educate your children on your culture and heritage and history without breaking the law and ending up being interrogated, right, and going to jail? It's that serious. When it comes to the daily life in Palestine, I mean, Palestinians are very resilient and creative people, but there's a lot of poverty, and this is really where my heart is. You know, NGOs came in, and Palestine is, if you read The Economist, they'll tell you about captive economy. And they are very dependent on Israeli economy, of course. But one thing that strikes you, of course, when you go there, and the first year in particular for me was very painful because I was getting my Fulbright money, over $99,000 a year, and then I was getting also half of my salary from the United States. So it was good. But then you start talking to people, getting to know friends, visiting people. You have people who live on $400 a month, 2,000 shekels, you know, employees of the PA. Many people that I've talked to live on bread and olives the whole month. I mean, it's a serious issue. But you know, these people are willing to sell everything they have in order to send their kids to school. But again, you know, there are people over the years, you know, with all of these catastrophes and setbacks and problems, have found sort of ways of maybe saving a little or doing with little. But Palestinians are very resilient. And you see that in the way that people, you know, you go to the market and you bargain for everything, right? It's not because they just like bargaining, it's because you have limited resources. So I think, I don't know if I'm answering your question, but one of the things that I really is disturbing about Palestinian society in the last few years, and this is where, again, I'm not going to belabor the point about Zizek, but where I find Zizek's insight really incredible, is the polarization of wealth around the world and the polarization of wealth in Palestine. In my other lecture that I suggested to Jim, I really go into that fundamental antagonism really deep. And I use slides of images of palaces in Palestine, built by Palestinians, according to medieval architecture. That's what struck me when I first moved to Ramallah. What is this? Why are they choosing, and I did my research on medieval architecture, palaces with everything that is known about a medieval palace. And if that is not symptomatic of the polarization of wealth in Palestine, I don't know what it is. But you have a new novo-rich class in Palestine who have been thriving on NGOs' monies. A lot of NGO money is dumped there. And people, if you are fluent in English or other languages and you have certain connections, you can make good money. Somebody harassed me since I got to Bethlehem, to Ramallah, to Bir Zayd. He was just, give me your title. I'm full professor of English. Just give me your title, and I'll get you $5,000 to $10,000 a month. You don't have to do anything. Just like that with translation jobs. If you are looking for money, you can find it. Plenty of it, and many people made a lot of money out of that. But that does not represent really the majority of Palestinians.
Are there factories there?
There are limited number in certain areas, industrial areas, but they are also small scale. And actually, in order to go back to the next question, which links back to the unskilled labor, if you heard Tony Blair went to Palestine a couple of months back, they wanted to start new economic, what they call them, area zones or whatever, economic zones, international economic zones, where they start attracting international corporations to use cheap Palestinian labor to produce expensive commodities that Palestinians cannot buy. And this is where I sort of, it sparked that sort of thing. And I, again, sometimes when I don't have time to write, but because I'm writing a book on Palestine, and it's really taking a lot of time from me because I'm trying to make a good case for this sort of post-Marxist reading. I know I'm going to be attacked bad time for it, but I really believe in it. The polarization of wealth in it, what is going on now, the integration of Palestine as a peripheral economic zone in the global economy, we are getting there. We're going to see it. Tony Blair is only the first person to raise it and talk to President Abbas about it, but you will see it happening over and over. In terms of the unskilled labor, I think once you impoverish schools, once you take out the life of students' desire to pursue their education, once you water down education that students simply, you dumb it down completely, there's no other options for these students if they want to live and their dream is to sort of build a house and marry or whatever, or do things in life, is simply to go and work in Israel. And many of them do work in Israel, which is more, quote unquote, lucrative than working in the West Bank. I go to sort of, because my wife and I work in Bethlehem, so I used to cook every day in the past. Now I can't. With this deanship position, my cooking skills got really bad. I just don't have the time for it. But so we eat outside, and then I talk to people, to these young men who work in these restaurants, and then sort of we start developing friendships, and I would ask them about how much you make. And I don't know, 60 shekels, 70 shekels, like $20 a day, from 8 o'clock in the morning till 10, you know, all day you are there making 60 shekels, 70 shekels. It's very hard. So when they go to Israel and they're paying them 200 or 300 or 400 shekels, about $100 or more, it's a lot of money. And back then, when Israel first colonized the occupied territories, many people made fortunes by working in Israel. They did. So it's a deliberate attempt at creating that unskilled labor force. And of course, they're going to go work for companies, right? Many of them are Israelis, but also many of them are international. And these Israeli companies target global consumers. So it's part of this sort of global economy. So impoverishing these students, watering down their education, making them hate their schools, right, is really the way into creating more profit for these big corporations. In terms of the alternative systems of education, actually, when the Israelis were cracking down on teachers and universities, many teachers, I know at Birzeit University, for example, heartbreaking stories that I heard from my colleagues there about how they started an underground education system. Okay, they call it the underground education system, where they went to places, so the department secretary, the night before classes meet, will tell you, will call you or send you a message or whatever, go to the basement of Church X. Don't say anything to anybody. So the class meets at the basement of that church, and they have their class. Or today we're going to go and meet at the house of the professor. You come there. So they developed that underground system and worked for many years. But there's no alternative now to it. Now it's completely, because of the PA and people think it's independent, so people can, and the PA has really been working very hard on doing these things, but again, it's really restrained under the conditions of the Israeli occupation, especially in terms of developing the curriculum. Because if you teach your students history, it means that it's actually an attack on Israel. If you teach them about the Nakba, then you are denying Israel's right to exist. So you are in a catch-22. In terms of engaging student unions and Israeli student unions, I think that you have to be careful about how you sort of look at it, and many Palestinians are wary of these kind of dialogues that simply lead to normalization of the occupation. We create these kind of dialogues that in the end will show, you see how beautiful they are together? It's actually I saw Benetton store in Dublin. Who still buys at Benetton? After the scandals in the 1980s and 90s, the racism of Benetton. But that's exactly what you do, a world of, we're all living together happily, let's have a Teletubby hug and we'll move on. But the thing is that dialogue is important, but what is happening is that it's used as a way to whitewash the occupation.
Between Israeli and Palestinian students' union.
Correct.
Yeah, no, what I mean is that I know that the European Students' Union made a trip this year.
Oh, the European, okay.
And they couldn't go to Palestine.
Oh yeah, absolutely.
So basically what I'm wondering is this a problem? Like I know that USI tried to develop Palestinian solidarity in 2012.
Right.
And what I'm wondering is like for student unions outside of Palestine that may want to develop solidarity.
Right. Oh, I mean, again, the restrictions, sorry, go ahead,
It's
sorry.
just like a beginning of like, I suppose USI trying to bring in Palestinian solidarity by some sort of boycott of, I don't know, Israeli education, something like that. But it's kind of evolved, but I know that there's been a block on creating those links because of...
Yeah, when you get to the bridge or to the checkpoint and they ask you, what are you doing here? And you say, if you say bluntly and honestly, well, I'm going to meet some Palestinian students, well, go home. Bye-bye. That's what the simplest thing, the simplest answer to your question. Really, they're not going to allow these students to enter. But I know last year, after I left Birzeit, another Fulbright scholar from the United States contacted me and said, Jamil, I heard that you were in Birzeit. Do you mind if we Skype to talk a little bit about the education system there? I'm trying to go there too. I want a Fulbright. And I said, sure, okay. So she's of Persian origins, an American of Iranian origins. And we talked a little bit. And we sort of exchanged a couple of emails throughout her the first semester at Birzeit. And then I get an email from the chair of their department saying, Jamil, you don't know what happened. The lady, her name is Mona Lisa. Mona Lisa was detained. And she's not allowed to come back into the West Bank. So she had to stay in Jordan and teach via Skype for 4 months. They would not allow her in. And that happens on a daily basis with many foreign scholars. Not only with the Palestinian part going out, but those people are coming in. If you are honest or too honest, if you don't know that you can really get to the West Bank, you don't have to tell them you're going to the West Bank. You say, I'm going to Jerusalem, I'm vacationing in Tel Aviv, whatever. Then you can take a cab. So it's really, they're forcing people to lie. And it's a sad thing, but that's really, I have a story about an South African representative minister who was a minister who was turned back by the Israelis at the border. So imagine people without diplomatic immunity, what's going to happen to them.
I think we're going to leave it there. So can I just ask you to give a big hand?
Thank you.
Further questions? questions for him. I'm sure we could ask him over some hummus. I want to introduce just briefly the chairman of Academics for Palestine, Jim Roach. Jim and I were in Gaza together about 2.5 years ago. Jim went and lectured at the Islamic University in Gaza, and since that time, he's just been really tireless on this. He got the Teachers Union of Ireland incredibly to the academic boycott of Israeli institutions. There are many people in this
Thank you so much.
Great
Appreciate it.
for Palestine over many years, but I certainly have not been among you. I know that's one of the thanks he wants to make now.
Yes, just to detain you for a few more minutes. Thanks, Harry. Just to say that lots of other people who aren't here wanted to be here. For example, the 4 officers of the Student Union of the DIT, unfortunately, they're at their first governing body of the Institute, so they send apologies, but they would like to have been here. Also, the Assistant Secretary General of the TUI really wanted to be here, but couldn't make it due to a last-minute funeral she had to go to, so I just do want to note that. I want to thank a few people, Salem Garbi, Greg, who did the filming at the last minute, Fatin Tamimi. A big thanks to John Kelly and the Irish Friends of Bethlehem University, because John has set this whole thing up, and we wouldn't be had this lecture tonight without him and his colleagues. I want to thank Dominic Delan, who's head of school at the College of Catering in Cathal Street, DIT, who is kindly taking our lecturer and the students out for dinner later on. So thanks to Dominic, and of course there's a great connection between the School of Catering and Bethlehem University. I want to make a general thanks to Teachers Union of Ireland for their support to me, both at branch level and in headquarters, in terms of supporting my interest in Palestine. And I want to thank Basil Ziadeh at Jerusalem Restaurant, whose food we are about to receive. If you haven't been to Jerusalem Restaurant, you should go there sometime. One last kind of point I would like to make, and some references have been made to South Africa, and it ties in with the food, because you're about to receive, for those of you drinking wine, you'll be drinking South African wine. And just over 20 years ago, we would not have been able to do that because of the boycott of South African goods, which was very, very prominent in Ireland, against a boycott against an apartheid state. Jamil made reference to South Africa. I'm going to make another reference. I think it's very important. I think there's very strong links. I urge you to see this DVD, Roadmap to Apartheid, made by an Israeli Jew and a white South African, narrated by Alice Walker, and it draws the connections between white apartheid South Africa and what Israel is doing to the Palestinians in a very convincing way, in my view. There are differences, I acknowledge that, but a lot of similarities. And of course, 2 of the great leaders, South African leaders, fighters against apartheid, acknowledged these differences. Nelson Mandela said, "We know too well that our freedom is incomplete without the freedom of the Palestinians." And Archbishop Desmond Tutu, just two short sentences. "I have witnessed the systematic humiliation of Palestinian men, women and children by members of the Israeli security forces. The humiliation is familiar to all black South Africans who are corralled and harassed and insulted and assaulted by the security forces of the apartheid government. In South Africa, we could not have achieved our democracy without the help of people around the world, who through the use of non-violent means, such as boycotts and divestment, encouraged their governments and other corporate actors to reverse decades-long support for the apartheid regime." And that is what inspires us in Academics for Palestine to pursue the academic boycott, among other boycotts. We now have over 250 people 250 academics throughout the island of Ireland who have signed our pledge. I urge those of you who haven't to consider signing it, at least take our pamphlet and read about it, and keep in touch with us. Lastly, again, I would like you to thank Jamil and the 4 students for being here with us. Now the food.
The reception is